the United States and Europe began to apply intense pressure on the North. The reason was that Greenland, a territory the U.S. had long coveted, was moving to join Canada. As soon as this news broke, the entire world was in shock. The United States, which had its eyes on the island, and Europe, which sided with them, were deeply flushed with confusion.
How could they choose a quiet neighbor like Canada over the mighty United States? The White House, caught off guard, issued an emergency statement.
But the real reason Greenland was pursuing integration with Canada was because of this specific Canadian quality. When that reason was revealed, even citizens in Europe took to the streets to support Greenland's decision to join Canada. What exactly is this quality that made Greenland choose Canada over the world's strongest superpower? And why did the indigenous people of Greenland choose the true North instead of the American giant? From now on, the story of Canada's bid for Greenland, which shocked the world, begins. My name is Liam, and I was born in Nuuk, Greenland. I grew up between a Ukrainian grandmother who fled hardship in Eastern Europe to find a new home and an Inuit grandfather. I now work as a civil servant responsible for international relations and security in the Greenlandic self-government. A few days ago, when the breaking news first flashed across the screen, I was staring blankly at the monitor in a corner of the City Hall conference room. Subtitles rolled endlessly, stating that the U.S. and Europe were raising their voices to pressure Canada. The news anchor looked bewildered, saying he couldn't understand why Greenland would push for integration with Canada. The panelists on the screen treated Canada as just a polite, resource-rich neighbor to the U.S. The panelists on the screen treated Canada as just a polite, resource-rich neighbor to the U.S. European experts shook their heads, questioning whether Canada had the capacity to manage the Arctic. Their words were sharp, but honestly, at that time, similar doubts existed among us as well. Since childhood, I had been taught that the United States was the absolute power dominating this region. I had always seen Europe acting as if it were the true owner of Greenland. To me, Canada was just a friendly country famous for maple syrup, ice hockey, and polite travelers. It didn't seem to have anything to do with hardline Arctic security. As the breaking news continued, the commentary from the American side became increasingly blunt. They called Canada a middle power on the periphery. They concluded that Greenland choosing Canada over the superpower next door was an emotional mistake. European panelists devalued Canada, claiming it was a nation inevitably subordinate to either the U.S. or Europe. Listening to those words, I couldn't find any immediate grounds to refute them. Back then, I wasn't sure if Canada was a nation strong enough to withstand all that pressure. I walked out into the hallway, where colleagues were gathering in small groups, whispering. Someone said Canada would soon give up on our proposal because they were afraid of the U.S. Another colleague blamed us, saying Greenland was moving too emotionally. Standing among them, I looked out the window at the frozen ocean and thought silently. Was our judgment to choose Canada correct? The moment the U.S. and Europe turn their backs on us, where will this small island and its people be pushed to? When I returned home and turned on the television, the situation was even more heated. An American broadcast called the move a political gamble and poured out commentary that sounded like a warning to Greenland. Some European channels questioned whether Canada could even meet Arctic environmental protection standards. One host referred to Canada not as a traditional power, but merely as a resource economy, dismissing it as too lightweight to take responsibility for Greenland. Several guests nodded in agreement. Watching that scene, I felt a chill in my chest, but at the same time, I felt a strange spark. Stories my grandmother used to tell me when I was young flashed through my mind. She spoke of the Ukrainian settlers who were driven from their homelands and wandered until they chose the cold Canadian prairies. She told me how they worked harder than anyone else to build a community from the frozen earth. Grandmother always used to say, "A truly strong people endures without trampling on others." Recalling those words, I suddenly felt ashamed that I knew so little about the country called Canada. That night, I gave up on sleep and sat at my desk. When I opened my laptop and typed Canada into the search bar, my eyes naturally went to the critical articles written by the US and European press. Those articles defined Canada as an overrated, quiet nation. They acknowledged its economic size to an extent, but summarized its influence in international politics as limited. However, a desire grew within me to know if such evaluations were true, or just a convenient image created from their perspective. I didn't know it then. I didn't know that the search I started that night would become the starting point of a long journey to verify Canada's actual economic power, history, culture, military, healthcare, and education levels. And I couldn't imagine that in the process, the numbers and records would reveal how the US and Europe had viewed Canada with such a narrow perspective. The facts were about to shake my common sense. The next morning, on my way to City Hall, I had already made up my mind. Instead of following the voices of the great powers, I would verify Canada for myself. I vowed to dig deep to see if this quiet nation was truly a partner capable of shouldering Greenland's destiny. No one yet knew the real weapon Canada possessed. The decisive reason why Greenland pushed for integration with Canada remained unknown to the world. I couldn't yet gauge how surprised the world would be when that secret was revealed, or how the dismissive gazes toward Canada would be overturned. But one thing was clear. Since that night, my curiosity about Canada had changed from simple interest to a critical issue deciding the future of my family and everyone living on this land. I began to look into all official data and statistics regarding Canada, one by one. The story I am about to tell you is a record of the facts I have confirmed with my own eyes since that moment. From that day on, I checked the most basic facts to solve my doubts about Canada. First, I looked up economic indicators. If the US and European panelists were right that Canada was just a middle-sized resource state, there should be clear limits in GDP or export scale. But the first figure I faced was difficult to accept with my conventional wisdom. As of 2023, Canada's nominal GDP was ranking in the global top 10, establishing it as a massive economic power. Its trade volume consistently placed it among the world's elite trading nations. Behind the vast amount of technology, equipment, shipping, and aerospace machinery moving outside the Arctic Circle, Canadian brands appeared continuously. With just a few lines of statistics, I felt my preconceived notions shaking. Looking closer at export items, the numbers were even more surprising. Canadian technology in AI and telecommunications held top-tier global market shares. Their advancements in clean energy and electric vehicle components were stably positioned at the top of the supply chain. Canada's shipbuilding industry, particularly in specialized vessels and offshore platforms on the coasts of Halifax and Vancouver, was taking significant global orders. The industrial ecosystem was already being discussed as one of the key players to open the Northwest Passage. Every single number contradicted the image I had grown up hearing. It was true that the US and Europe viewed Canada as small, but the actual scale of its industry and economy had already surpassed that assessment. While verifying economic indicators, I also checked the historical background. Canada was a nation built on resilience and negotiation rather than conquest. Records showed that in the early 20th century, it was largely agrarian, but within decades it transformed into a G7 industrial powerhouse.
This shift was a growth curve that economic researchers evaluated as remarkably steady and robust. The OECD noted this in official reports as a model of stable economic evolution.
I didn't stop there. I checked Canada's education and research environment. In international academic achievement assessments, Canadian students consistently ranked near the top. The number of PhD graduates in science and engineering relative to the population was world-class. There were several years where national research and development spending relative to GDP ranked among the highest globally. Concrete statistics revealed that Canada was not a country that simply followed technology, but one that created and led it. The familiar prejudices I held were quickly losing their ground. Military power also exceeded the range I had expected. The Canadian Armed Forces, though often understated, were highly professional and technologically advanced. When including their reserve potential and alliances, their comprehensive power was consistently rated in the global top tier. Above all, this figure existed alongside a record that it had never been used for overseas aggression. Canada possessed a strong military, but had operated it solely for defense, peacekeeping, and deterrence. This point fit perfectly with the topic being seriously discussed within Greenland. We were looking for a country that knew how to restrain its power, rather than one that flaunted it. When checking Canada's healthcare system, I honestly felt an emotion close to awe. The public health insurance system covered virtually all citizens. Medical accessibility was rated as some of the best in the world. Average life expectancy, a key international comparison indicator, surpassed the United States and rivaled top European nations. Survival rates for major diseases like cancer remained in the top rankings. For me, living in an old Inuit village covered in ice and snow, the concept of a state providing healthcare to every single person was profound. Organizing the statistics, I felt it. Canada's growth and capacity were not emotional overestimations, but facts clearly proven by numbers and records. Yet, a paradoxical thing happened. As Canada's name appeared more frequently, the tone of the US and European media became even more resolute. Rather than acknowledging Canada's capabilities, commentaries continued to doubt how such a polite nation could achieve such results. Some programs acknowledged Canada's development, but concluded it was entirely due to American support. Others treated Canada as a temporary phenomenon, dismissing its potential role as an emotional choice. But right at that point, my thinking completely changed. They doubted the facts and attached various interpretations, but the numbers did not move. The Canadian economy was solid. Its technology had reached the world summit, and its military and healthcare systems were stable. And all these changes were results derived from a process aimed at internal improvement and the quality of life for its citizens, not for overseas expansion. It strangely resembled the model Greenland society was desperately looking for. I realized then that the world's view of Canada was outdated. The world did not understand even half of the standards by which that country operated. From that day on, the atmosphere inside City Hall began to change. Someone quietly approached my desk and asked me to share the Canadian data. Subtle changes followed. As the verified figures piled up, the voices ignoring Canada lost their strength, and opinions grew that we needed to grasp the reality. I recalled a sentence my grandmother used to say, "True strength is not shouted, it is revealed." I finally realized how close that saying was to the truth. But the facts I had learned were just the beginning. The true face of Canada that the world didn't know had not yet been properly revealed. The decisive reason why Greenland pushed for integration with Canada remained a secret. The things to be revealed in the next stage were the subjects the US and Europe feared most. They were the most critical elements by which Canada could shake the world order just by standing still. I realized clearly at that moment why I needed to dig deeper.
As my understanding of Canada deepened, I wondered why the world had failed to see Canada properly for so long.
I felt there was something inside that country that couldn't be explained simply by economic indicators or technology.
To fit the puzzle pieces together, I began to look more closely at its history and social structure. Specifically, I needed to confirm where the core lay that kept Greenland's choice unwavering. The American press and European experts still called Canada an overrated state, but the more I dug into the records, the more a huge gap existed between those evaluations and the data. First, I looked into the turning points of modern Canadian history. The records of overcoming the Great Depression and the World Wars showed a resilience that was rare in history. During times when the population was small and the land vast and unforgiving, reports appeared repeatedly about building infrastructure across a continent. The process of the government and private sector building an industrial base together became a research subject for other nations decades later. What stood out was that most of the institutions leading Canada's stability still exist today. The fact that Canadian banks, crown corporations, and research institutes moved not separately, but with a unified goal for decades, was an area the US and Europe failed to evaluate. The records clearly showed that the nation's achievements could not be explained simply by external help. Statistics showing that the capital Canada raised itself increased 2 or 3 times over time, far exceeding any aid, demolished such misunderstandings. According to actual records, the Canadian government aggressively invested in key industries. As a result, in half a century, the industrial structure shifted from agriculture and resources to advanced technology. In this process, the history of my Ukrainian ancestors naturally came to mind. My grandparents' generation, who came from Europe, built a foundation for life from nothing. Their appearance and Canada's nation-building process were surprisingly similar. Both groups shared the same temperament of taking root and making a way in an environment where no one expected success. I began to feel that this commonality was one of the reasons Greenlandic society was particularly drawn to Canada. On the surface, we are a small land where Inuit and settlers live together, but inside, a spirit of never giving up sits like a root. Canada's history fit that sentiment perfectly. Canada's history regarding war showed this temperament even more clearly. Canada had participated in major wars, but never to conquer territory for itself. Despite living next to a giant empire, Canada chose protection and peacekeeping over aggression. Even through the scars of history, it did not invade its neighbors. That fact might be just the past to outsiders, but to us, who have a strong will for independence, it approached with decisive meaning. A country that has power but does not abuse it. A country that chose coexistence instead of oppression. This was a condition Greenland could not find in either the US or Europe. The foundation of Canadian culture was also an interesting point. An attitude valuing education was melted into the culture, beyond simple competition. According to news articles, Canada's tertiary education attainment rate was the highest in the world. The government steadily expanded scholarship policies and research support to retain talent. This meant it was a country capable of stably producing the manpower needed for future industries. The US and Europe viewed Canada's progress as quiet, steady growth. But checking the numbers and policies in the data, it was clear Canada was a nation continuing systematic development. In terms of the speed, direction, and sustainability of growth, Canada was already creating a new baseline. This is likely the point that makes superpowers most anxious, because the achievements Canada has shown so far had greater power in qualitative change than in scale. This was an area difficult to explain with the national evaluation methods the world used previously. I finally began to understand the world's reaction. The US defined Greenland's choice of Canada as a simple diplomatic mistake, but evidence was piling up everywhere. Canada was a nation ready to enter the Arctic Circle. It possessed economic power, technology, a talent system, and military deterrence. Above all, it used all this power not for external domination, but for mutual benefit. This realization was not mine alone. Within City Hall and among the residents, the perception of Canada began to quietly change. The expectations and emotions we relied on at first gradually disappeared, and voices grew to view Canada based on practical reality. In that process, the community of descendants of settlers spoke of Canada's potential faster than anyone. Those who have watched each other's lives on the frozen sea knew how to verify what the true foundation was. But the most core question remained unsolved. I could understand that Canada was strong and solid, but why did that country need Greenland? And why did they reach out to us? No one could clearly answer what the decisive core of the push for Greenland's integration was. I felt I was getting closer to that real reason. I also deepened my conviction that the moment the answer was revealed, the world order would inevitably be shaken greatly. From then on, the question before us was simple. Not where did Canada's power come from, but why do they want to share that power with us? From that point on, I expanded my scope to the entire social and national system to confirm the deeper layers hidden in Canada's growth. There was something that couldn't be explained by economics, military, education, and healthcare alone. Records appeared repeatedly that Canada created order and followed norms to grow, even when the world did not force or demand it. US and European media rarely covered these characteristics. Rather, there were many reports dismissing Canada as just a polite, rule-following nation. However, according to actual data, Canada developed its industry in a way that valued cooperation and technology sharing as much as competition. This acted as the core of maintaining national stability to this day. What was particularly impressive was Canada's crisis response capability. The fact that the core system did not collapse despite experiencing various difficulties, like global financial crises and pandemics, was a record that stood out. Canada quickly modified policies whenever a crisis hit. The government and citizens moved together, and the entire society reacted like a single unit. Here, I found a characteristic distinct from other countries. Canada overcame crises not by forced mobilization, but by a method close to a sense of shared responsibility. This cultural operating method was clearly difficult to see from the outside. The fact that people trusted each other appeared in specific examples. When disasters like floods or wildfires occurred, records confirmed that thousands of volunteers gathered instantly. Reports that disaster recovery proceeded faster than expected in general nations were repeated several times. This was a point Greenland society particularly noted. If it is a society that accepts even unknown neighbors as members of the community and connects with action, there is much we can learn. Stories naturally came out within City Hall. In this process, I once again recalled the lifestyle shared by the settlers and the Inuit. In the harsh nature where we cannot survive without each other, we shared food and endured for decades. Canada was in a different environment, but maintained a community in a similar structure. In this respect, our society began to feel a deep connection with Canada's direction. Greenland as a whole came to perceive Canada not as a simple diplomatic target, but as a colleague we could empathize with. Meanwhile, the reactions of the US and Europe became increasingly sharp. As they reached a stage where they had to acknowledge Canada's growth, they threw another question. Is Canada really ready to handle a global role? Some broadcasts tried to cite examples, saying Canada lacked the ability to solve Arctic problems. But in reality, the discussion could not continue due to a lack of data supporting their claims. Rather, Canada's polar research was deeper than thought. It was revealed that they had been operating research stations in the high north for decades. continuing environmental surveys and climate research.
The moment it was confirmed who had accumulated the Arctic research data, the existing claims lost their power.
Voices ignoring Canada within Europe gradually lowered. Like ice melting in the spring sun, their evaluation slowly softened. Now, the world was getting closer to a forced conclusion. Canada was not a country that could be evaluated simply by economic or military power. It was a nation with resilience across society and a long-term growth structure, and this fact was undeniable. It was a result accumulated over generations, not changed overnight. But I still held on to the most important question. Why did Canada choose Greenland? Neither the US nor Europe could answer that question, and various interpretations were divided even within Greenland. Some said it was to open the Northwest Passage. Others claimed it was a strategy to obtain rare resources. But in the data I found, there was almost no evidence supporting such purposes. Then I decided to change my direction. Instead of asking what Canada wants to gain, I decided to look at what standards Canada acts by. At this point, I discovered a fact I hadn't realized in the earlier stage data. There was a consistent philosophy in Canada's policy and diplomatic moves. It was close to a grand principle, beyond simple profit. And I felt confident that this was closest to the reality of the answer, not yet revealed. The world underestimated the size of Canada's power, but they underestimated the standards and direction that moved Canada even more. Now, if that standard were revealed, I instinctively knew why the US and Europe feared Canada's move so much. And the answer began to reveal itself in the very next stage. From that point on, I started looking for deeper materials. I wanted to confirm how the country called Canada reached that position, and what structure was hidden beyond simple numbers. There was something that couldn't be explained by economics and military power alone. I had a hunch that this was the core that directed Greenland toward Canada. First, what stood out was Canada's system stability, revealed in crises. Even during periods of financial shock or pandemic spread, Canada did not collapse. Looking at accurate records, a pattern appeared where economic growth rates rebounded after every major crisis. Reports analyzing this showed that the speed of citizen response and policy execution was faster than the global average. This was a case difficult to find in other countries. Even compared to nations known as economic powerhouses, Canada's competitiveness was confirmed by various agencies. Discussions among experts inside Greenland also changed. The US or Europe tried to judge only by national scale and military power. But we considered the ability to maintain survival as important. It was an analysis like the instinct of the Inuit society and the descendants of settlers who lived in a strict environment. We knew well that a community cannot last without cooperation in harsh nature. I started to think that Canada was a nation that reached the same conclusion in a different form of environment. My conviction grew as I looked at the figures regarding the movement of civilians in disaster situations. Records showed massive numbers of volunteers organizing within a day of floods and wildfires. Reports existed that the recovery speed of damaged areas proceeded about 40% faster than international standards. Expert analysis supported that this was not due to a command system, but a culture where citizens moved themselves. Reading this data, I felt a strangely familiar emotion deep in my heart. The life of Greenlanders enduring the harsh winter is also maintained not by one individual surviving, but by everyone supporting each other. That power becomes the driving force, protecting the community and the next generation. As it was revealed that Canadian society also operated in such a way, the thought grew stronger that Canada was an entity with the same direction as us, not an outsider. Around this time, impatience grew in the US and Europe. An uncomfortable current formed as the stability and growth structure of Canada, which they tried not to acknowledge, were revealed by data.
Articles criticizing Canada's decision continued in the press, but their logic was close to emotional claims without concrete evidence. Conversely, journalists and scholars who verified actual data began to be surprised by the depth of the industrial, technological, and cultural foundation Canada possessed. The most common reaction from Europe was the prejudice that Canada could not understand Arctic problems. But the moment the facts were confirmed, those words collapsed. It was announced that Canada was one of the nations that had accumulated the most original data on Arctic ice. Some research periods were even longer than those of major European countries. After this fact was confirmed, the flow of evaluation within Europe changed irreversibly. When I reached this point, I realized the reason the world underestimated Canada for so long was that Canada's power had accumulated without being conspicuous. It wasn't something that grew explosively, but a structure completed by meshing experience and technology accumulated over generations. So, judging only by the surface, it looked like a quiet country, but in reality, it was a nation with deep substance. The conclusion became clear that it could be the country our Greenland needed to rely on and learn from. But I still hadn't let go of the most important question: why does Canada reach out to us, risking danger? If it were because of resources the world values, there should be a clue, but I couldn't find such a purpose in any data I read. Foreign affairs experts couldn't answer, and opinions were divided within Greenland, so I changed my approach. Instead of asking what Canada wants, I decided to look into what Canada believes in when it acts. The moment I gathered data in this direction, the outline that had been blurry became clear. The core principle explaining Canada's choice slowly revealed itself. The world not only underestimated Canada's power, but underestimated Canada's philosophy and standards even more. And right at that point, the real reason why the US and Europe began to fear Canada was appearing. From then on, I began to examine policy documents and the preamble of the Constitution to track Canada's selection criteria. At first, it was simple data searching, but as time went on, a strange tension built up in my heart. I had a premonition that the seemingly contradictory reasons for why Canada risked talking to Greenland would connect into one at some point. In the process, I began to understand a little why the US was anxious. Despite having economic power and technology, Canada had never coveted another country's resources or territory. Rather, it invested all its capabilities in protecting itself and was very cautious about external intervention. So I decided to look at a more fundamental part. I needed to confirm what rules Canada placed at the center of national operation. Right at that point, I discovered a decisive sentence. There were clear regulations in the Canadian Constitution and diplomatic principles. Phrases like peace, order, and good government, and a commitment to peacekeeping and self-determination appeared repeatedly. These were not just slogans, but fundamental values deciding the direction of the nation. As I turned the pages of the report, Canada's thing could actually be summarized as one thing. Canada's thing was exactly the principle of respecting the right of others to choose their own destiny. Because Canada itself had to navigate its path next to a giant, it practiced the philosophy that no one's dignity should be taken away. This was the rule the world powers found most uncomfortable. The background of the US's sensitive reaction was clear. The moment Canada acknowledged self-determination, Greenland could escape the US's hands and make an independent choice. At that moment, I understood. The reason Canada approached Greenland was not to get resources, nor just because of interest in the Arctic. Canada was simply executing the principles learned from its own history. Do not decide the fate of others. Do not push the weak just because you have power. Help anyone walk the path they chose themselves. Canada was moving by this exact principle. When this fact was shared, the atmosphere inside Greenland changed completely. The council members gathered in the meeting room read the data quietly and nodded. It strangely overlapped with the stories heard from our ancestors all our lives. We had vast land and wealth, but we were always entities belonging to someone. We were never given a single chance to choose for ourselves. They finally fully understood that to change that situation, we didn't need someone to fight for us, but the ability to decide our destiny ourselves. That was when it happened. The press in Europe and the US went into an uproar. Analyses followed that Canada was leaving a dangerous precedent. Interpretations appeared that a polite country broke the pattern of big countries. Evaluations began to emerge that Canada had thrown a challenge to the world with value standards, not just military and economic power. A nation had appeared that used principles and legitimacy as weapons, not force or market logic. A more surprising phenomenon also occurred. European citizens began to logically explain why they supported Canada. Canada did not try to design the world like the US. It did not repeat the colonial systems of the past like Europe. Public opinion spread that if it was a country returning rights to others, it was obvious which side Greenland would choose. Watching that scene, I was finally convinced. Canada's thing was not force, but philosophy. The power not to invade. The will to choose companionship instead of domination. The gaze that treats no one as an object. Canada was such a country from the start. The right to choose that Greenland dreamed of could only be realized on the principles Canada possessed. And from this time on, the world could no longer call Canada quiet or peripheral. The rules of the US and Europe were shaking. Canada's growth figures began to be recognized as evidence of a way to choose the future, not just simple numbers. Once Canada's principles were fully revealed to the world, the situation began to change at a greater speed. More nations understood why Greenland chose Canada, but the movements to stop it also became fiercer. The reaction from the United States was particularly blatant. In briefings held in Washington, claims appeared that Greenland's move was a threat to U.S. Arctic strategy. Expert panel discussions analyzed that if Greenland joined hands with Canada, U.S. influence could shrink. However, the focus of the debate was not economy or military. The part that U.S. media worried about most was the possibility of the Canadian model of choice spreading. The message that any country, small or large, could eventually choose its own path could spread beyond the Arctic to the Pacific and Africa. As scholars pointed out, if nations that had to rely on superpowers for survival started referencing Canada's case, the order the U.S. had built over decades could be reshaped. That anxiety was revealed like an emotion that couldn't be hidden anywhere. Europe was not quiet either. European research institutes, which initially ignored Canada, now began to analyze Canada's system and social structure. Evaluations changed with every line of the report. Negative descriptions turned into analysis based on figures like human resource base enabling innovation, world-class tertiary education rates, and maintaining 99% literacy. As undeniable data piled up, the critical tone of Europe turned toward curiosity and respect. The field that shocked the press most was the healthcare system. Canada's healthcare system, evaluated as being on a scale difficult to even compare with Greenland's, was famous for service delivery that didn't waver even in disasters. International organization reports concluded that Canada's medical accessibility was higher than the average of advanced nations. Some U.S. media added the evaluation that the very fact such a system existed without burdening citizens was shocking. The military also became a subject of reevaluation. Global experts who initially compared only numbers analyzed actual deployments and peacekeeping operations. They began to conclude that Canada was not an opponent to be handled lightly. One American analyst even mentioned, "Canada is a nation that grew while hiding itself, so it might be a much more dangerous opponent than it seems."
But that was not a word provoking fear, but an expression explaining Canada's uniqueness, a country that possessed power but refrained from using it.
It was a contradiction-like existence that most great powers could not reach rationally. Around this time, the atmosphere inside Greenland had completely changed. We no longer carefully hid the fact that we chose Canada. Rather, we could speak proudly. Because we became convinced that the object we were trying to rely on was not a country using the opponent's weakness, but a country recognizing each other as equal entities. In local meetings and community discussions, debates took place on applying the connection with Canada to real life. Plans for medical personnel exchange, higher education programs, and cooperation for sustainable development. All these discourses appeared naturally. And there was one important change: the fact that people who had left all decisions to the outside were designing their future themselves. The Inuit families making up our society had moved for survival for generations, but had never had the experience of choosing the nation's direction themselves. Canada's principle brought that opportunity, the promise not to dominate us, a promise no other superpower had ever given. We believed that promise, and were feeling the future that promise would create. Before even a month passed, discussions restarted in the quiet U.S. Congress. Opinions appeared that Canada should be recognized as a top-tier partner. The move, initially accepted as a provocation, had now turned into a reality that couldn't be ignored. Greenland joining hands with Canada began to be interpreted not as an enemy of the U.S., but as another new order. Watching that scene, I realized. Canada did not change the world with force. Respect the right to choose for oneself. That single sentence, that principle, shook the order of superpowers and let Greenland hold its destiny for the first time. And at this time, the world finally admitted Canada was not small, and Greenland was no longer a possession. The difference between what the US and Europe lost and what Canada kept was overturning all results. As Canada's principles were revealed to the world in detail, the situation began to change at greater speed. The path Greenland chose began to be treated as a symbol reshaping the world order, beyond a simple diplomatic event. Urgent reports were exchanged in meeting rooms in Washington and Brussels, and the name Canada was never missing. But in that debate, I sensed a subtle change. The flow shifted from voices trying to exclude Canada to opinions that they must cooperate with Canada. At some point, it was moving from coercion and pressure to a stage of acknowledging existence. In that process, the first to change direction were U.S. private research institutes and civil society. Unlike the initial criticism repeated by giant media, independent teams began to objectively analyze Canada's structure. The results repeatedly pointed to the same conclusion. Canada is a nation with a stable growth model. It built itself, and a nation applying fundamental principles of not repeating aggression or colonial experiences to administration and society. One U.S. internal report explained Canada's economic resilience with statistics on efficient talent redistribution and high education rates. When this data was released, a slight silence followed in both the U.S. and Europe. The moment came when they had to admit that the view minimizing Canada all this time was wrong. Canada was not a nation with just one developed technology, but a country that configured an entire system to handle crises and opportunities simultaneously. That was the ability a small community like Greenland needed most. As this fact was revealed, Greenland stood on equal footing with great powers for the first time. The fact that our decision was not a unilateral demand, but a judgment with grounds, was conveyed to the international community. It was exactly at this time that the U.S. delegation sent contact again, proposing to proceed with discussions on an equal footing. It was so different from the initial tone that no one could deny the change. The era of pushing with force ended, and the era of recognized choices opened. Discussions on cooperation with Canada developed more concretely. If it stopped at a simple exchange of opinions before, now it led to practical connections. Canadian university officials sent materials to prepare for educational exchanges. Joint research was proposed to improve Greenland's food system. Discussions on medical support also followed. We lacked beds and equipment, and professional staff placement was limited, but Canada reviewed plans to build infrastructure and transfer technology. Most importantly, nowhere in that process did Canada attach conditions. Many citizens in Greenland were shocked once again at this part. Historically, we were used to being asked for a price corresponding to any support we received. The U.S. demanded bases in exchange for security, and Europe exercised policy influence in exchange for subsidies. But Canada showed the will to provide help while respecting our right to choose, without demanding a price. The reason resembled the philosophy deeply engraved in the immigrant society as well. The idea of not repeating the pain one received to others. Expanding the community through coexistence. The atmosphere in Greenland brightened day by day. More children applied for English and French classes in schools. Elders began to learn about Canada's history. Each household talked about the future to be connected with Canada. Hope was now settling on the faces of people who had lived under the resignation of having no choice. In that process, the U.S. and European media began to look back on the facts they had overlooked. Canada was not a nation trapped in a frozen land, but a people who had expanded the meaning of territory and culture in their own way. In that process, it was a country that could understand the hearts of isolated communities like the descendants of settlers. The world finally began to realize what the real threat was: the fact that Canada was widening its borders with trust alone, without fighting a war. Watching that scene, I thought, the threat hidden behind strong power was no longer guns and tanks, but the principle of treating people like people. The hand Canada extended was not a hand to drag Greenland away, but a hand to let us walk on our own. We held that hand, and we were feeling that the choice was changing our history. As the cooperation process with Canada took shape, all of Greenland changed at a speed unimaginable before. Our society, which waited for policy instructions and relied on foreign aid, was now moving to a stage of planning and executing for itself. That change became clearer when the Canadian government officially released the cooperation document with Greenland. Canada's announcement was surprisingly neat and humble, the policy stating, "We respect Greenland's autonomy and identity and will provide support only upon request," was clearly written. Sincerity found nowhere else was contained in those sentences. The declaration to recognize us as partners unconditionally was the voice we had wanted for so long. It was a sentence difficult to find in the U.S. or Europe, so its meaning stood out even more. After that announcement, the situation around the Arctic fluctuated even more. The U.S. put forth other proposals to regain lost territory. Several European countries showed a cooperative attitude, signaling hope to restore relations, albeit late. But from that point on, the question of whose permission we needed to move disappeared from within Greenland. We decided for ourselves, and that decision was already conveyed to the world. As a person who watched the center of that change, I became convinced that all this process was not a momentary accident. It was the result of a voice suppressed for decades finally bursting out. The experience of living as a descendant of exiles made that realization stronger. My ancestors endured thousands of years on this land, but never ruled the land. They were always under someone's flag and never got the chance to represent themselves. It finally became clear that what was needed to change that fate was not power, but the freedom to choose. The direction Canada showed was the substance of that freedom,
the possibility of being together without dominating. The evidence that coordination and cooperation are stronger than oppression. Diplomacy that confirms the direction the other wants first. All of that was a concept close to revolution in Greenland. Watching that change, even the US and Europe had to slowly revise their conclusions. Foreign affairs advisors who initially opposed began to offer opinions that Canada's approach might be more stable in the long run. They witnessed in real time how the value possessed by one country changed the fate of another. At that point, all my emotions were sorted out. Canada did not want Greenland, but made the future Greenland wanted possible. The world understood this simple fact too late. The status of the US did not decrease, and the existence of Europe did not disappear. Just the center of power moved a little, and the right to a legitimate choice came up on the table. After that day, I returned to my daily life, but the world had already changed. I saw children greeting each other in English and French crossing the square. Fishermen talked about new sea routes. Restaurant owners looked forward to ingredients coming from Canada. School teachers said students would meet a new world through educational exchanges. All changes might look very small and slow, but they contained the power of the wind moving again, which had been stopped for hundreds of years. On a quiet night, I looked up at the sky in the cold Arctic wind. From some day on, the aurora was no longer a symbol of fear. It was not a symbol of a vague and precariously shaking future. That light was evidence of the choice we made. It was comfort for the time we endured until that day, and support for the generation we would create. And I knew our story is just beginning. Canada gave us back the rights we lost and was the first nation to recognize us as partners. That choice was not a simple diplomatic event, but the moment our people opened the door for themselves for the first time. We are no longer possessions, nor entities standing forcibly under any flag. We are walking the path we chose, and that path will remain on the world map with the name Canada.